My parents made me pretend I was the one who got pregnant so my 14-year-old sister could stay in school. When I told my mother I was losing everything I had worked for, she looked at me and said, "That is what big sisters are for." I did not answer. I did not answer for 3 years. Last week I spent $40 at a walk-in lab, and that one piece of paper put 4 adults in handcuffs. I was 17 when my mother told me in a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning that my sister's pregnancy was going to be mine from that night forward, and that if I ever said otherwise, it would be my fault when Becca's whole life ended. Becca was 14. She had been throwing up for 3 weeks and telling everyone it was the cafeteria chicken. My mother had driven her to the emergency room in Harrow County at midnight and come back out to the car alone, and she got into the passenger seat where I was waiting with the engine running, and she did not cry and she did not shake. She said the words like she was reading a grocery list. "Becca is pregnant. You are going to say it is you." I laughed. I actually laughed because it sounded like a joke somebody would tell badly. Then my father came out of the sliding doors and got in the back seat and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We already talked about it," and I understood that they had talked about it in the 20 minutes between finding out and telling me, and that in those 20 minutes they had decided which of their 2 daughters was expendable. Becca went to Halden Academy on a full scholarship. Halden had a conduct clause, 1 page, 6 paragraphs, and paragraph 4 said that any student whose conduct brought public disrepute on the school could be removed without appeal and without refund. My mother had that page memorized. She recited it to me in the parking lot with the windows fogging up. Becca had a 4.0 and a spot in the early medical track and a picture of herself on the wall in the front office with 3 other kids under a banner that said Halden leads. I went to Marbury High, which is the school you go to when you do not go to Halden, and I had a full ride to the Calder State Nursing Program starting in September, which I had earned by getting my certified nursing assistant license at 16 and working 340 hours at Pinehurst Care Center on the night shift while I was still taking chemistry. My mother knew that. She had come to the ceremony, she had clapped. And in that parking lot, she looked at the 2 futures on the table and she picked the one with the banner. "Halden will pull her," she said. "Marbury will not pull you. You already have your certificate. You can go to school later. Becca cannot go to Halden later." That was the arithmetic. That was the whole thing. 14 years old and a photograph on a wall, against 17 years old and a piece of paper that said I could wipe somebody down and take their blood pressure. My father said it was temporary. My father said a lot of things were temporary. I asked the only question that mattered, which was who, and my mother turned her face to the window and said, "We are not doing that tonight," and my father said it does not change anything, and neither of them ever answered it. Not that night and not for 3 years. And it took me 3 years to understand that the silence was not shame. The silence was the entire point. Here is how you make one daughter into another. You do it with paperwork and geography. 2 days after the hospital, my mother pulled me out of Marbury High and told the office I had a health situation and would be finishing by correspondence. She wrote health situation on the form in her round, careful handwriting. Then she called Calder State and deferred my seat, which she was able to do because I was still a minor and she was still my legal guardian, and she had every one of my passwords in a green spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer. Then she found Ellisview Women's Clinic, which is 4 hours away across the state line, the kind of place that advertises discretion in the phone book, and she made an appointment under my name and my insurance and my date of birth. Then she and Becca and I got in the car and we drove 5 months out of our lives. We rented a 2-bedroom over a hardware store in a town where nobody knew us. My mother told the neighbors I was the pregnant one and Becca was the little sister who came along to help. Becca wore my old sweatshirts. I wore a maternity band my mother bought at a thrift store and stuffed with a folded towel, and I want you to understand that I put it on every single morning for 5 months in front of a mirror by myself before I made coffee. My father drove up on weekends. He kept working at Ashby Auto Body because we could not afford for him not to, and he brought groceries and cash in a plain white envelope every Friday, and I did not think anything of the envelope for 3 years. That is the part I still cannot forgive myself for. The envelope was right there. It came every Friday. It was thicker than my father's paycheck had any business being. Grant Ashby owned the shop where my father worked, and Grant Ashby held the second note on our house, and Grant Ashby had been at every barbecue and every birthday and every one of Becca's award nights since I was 9 years old, and he drove her home from things when my parents were busy, and my parents were always busy, and nobody in that house ever once asked why a 41-year-old man wanted to be at a middle school awards night. I did not ask either. I was 17, and I was standing in a rented bathroom with a towel taped to my stomach, and I was not asking anything. June was born in March. I was in the room. Becca was in the bed, and my mother was holding her hand and telling her to breathe, and I was standing by the wall in scrubs I had brought from Pinehurst so I would look like staff, and a nurse asked me twice if I was family, and I said I was the sister, and my mother said sharply that I was the aunt, and then caught herself, and the nurse looked at both of us for 1 second too long, and then went back to what she was doing. That 1 second is in my head forever. Somebody almost saw us. Somebody almost pulled the whole thing apart in March, and then the moment closed. Becca was 15 by then. She had turned 15 in January in a rented apartment over a hardware store with a grocery store cake and 4 candles, because that was all the box had. When they gave June to her, she looked at her for maybe 40 seconds, and then my mother took the baby and put her in my arms and said, "From right now," and Becca started crying, and my mother said, "Stop it. Someone will hear you." The paperwork happened the next morning. Ellisview had an administrator named Renata Bell who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and who did not look at any of us while she worked. My mother had gotten to her somehow. I did not know how then. Renata Bell typed my name into the mother field and my date of birth and my social security number, and she typed unknown into the father field, and she printed it and she slid it across the counter and she said, "Initial here and sign at the bottom," and I signed my own name to a lie that would take 3 years and a court order to unsign. They gave me a wristband with the room number on it and the date, a thin plastic band, and I put it in my pocket instead of throwing it away, and I do not know why I did that. I want to say it was instinct. I think it was just that I could not make myself throw anything away that week. I kept it. It went into a shoebox with a rubber band around it, and the shoebox went on the top shelf of my closet under a stack of Marbury High yearbooks, and it sat there for 3 years being nothing until the day it was everything. We came home to Marbury in April. My mother drove, and I sat in the back with the car seat, and Becca sat up front. And about 20 miles out, my mother pulled into a gas station and turned around and gave us the rules. Becca, you were with your grandmother in Ohio. You had mono. Ren, you made a mistake, and we are a family that does not throw people away. Do not add details. Details are how people get caught. If anyone asks who the father is, you look at the floor and you say you would rather not talk about it, and you keep saying that until they stop. And Becca, you do not touch that baby in public. Not once. Becca said, okay. She was 15 years old, and she said, okay. And she looked out the window, and I have thought about that word more than almost anything else in my life. Then my mother looked at me in the rear view and said, I know this is hard. And I said, I am losing everything I worked for. And she said, that is what big sisters are for. I did not answer. I want to be very clear that I did not answer, because for 3 years, my silence in that car got told back to me as agreement. My mother would say, you agreed? You never objected. You could have said something at the gas station. I was 17 and I had a 5-week-old baby who was not mine in a car seat beside me. And I did not know the word coercion yet. And so I said nothing. And my nothing got entered into the record as yes. Marbury is 9,000 people. It took about 4 days. The first one was a woman at the fresh market who had known my mother since high school. And she looked into the stroller and then looked at my hands for a ring and then looked at my face and did the small, tight smile that I would come to know like a second language. That smile followed me for 3 years. It was at the pharmacy and the gas station and the DMV and the bank. It was at my father's company picnic. It was on the face of my old chemistry teacher when I ran into her outside the library, a woman who had written my Calder State recommendation letter, and she said, oh, and then she said, well, and then she said, congratulations, in a voice like she was setting something down carefully. Marbury High put my name on nothing that year. I had been on the honor wall. They repainted that section over the summer, and my name did not go back up. And my mother said that was a coincidence, and maybe it was, and it does not matter, because I stood in that hallway at a football game with June on my hip, and I looked at the blank paint, and I understood what I had become in that town. Halden never found out a thing. Becca's picture stayed on the wall in the front office under the banner. She made honor roll in the fall. My mother framed it. Here is the ladder, and I want you to see the rungs, because at the time I could not see them at all. I was 17, and it was a lie I told with my mouth. That was rung 1. Words are cheap. I told myself I could carry words. At 18, it stopped being words. 18 was when I aged out of my parents being able to speak for me, which should have been freedom, and instead was the exact moment they needed my signature on things. 18 was when I signed the daycare enrollment as the mother, and the pediatric intake as the mother, and the state assistance application as the mother, which is a federal form, which is a thing I did not think about for 2 more years. 18 was when I called Calder State to undefer my seat and found out that a deferral is 1 year, not 2, and that my scholarship had been reallocated in June, and the woman on the phone was kind about it, which was worse. Rung 2. At 19, it stopped being paperwork and became my whole life. Becca started 10th grade at Halden with a lab internship. I started full-time nights at Pinehurst, 6 on to 6:30, 4 nights a week, and I came home at 7 in the morning to a house where my mother handed me June and went back to bed, because June was mine, and mine meant mine at 7 in the morning after a 12-and-a-half-hour shift. I slept in 90-minute pieces for a year and a half. I learned to fall asleep sitting up on the floor with my back against the crib. Rung 3. And at 20, they wanted it in writing forever. That is rung 4. And that is where this actually starts, because here is the thing they had not told me. The thing I did not learn until I was 20 years old, and it was almost too late to matter. I was June's mother on paper. I was not June's guardian. When I signed that birth certificate at Ellisview, I was 17, a minor, and a minor cannot be the sole legal custodian of a child. So my parents had filed for guardianship of June in Harrow County the same month we came home, and I had signed that too, in the kitchen, between a shift and a nap, with my mother saying, it is just so we can take her to the doctor if you are at work. 3 years of shame with none of the rights. That was the shape of it. I had every consequence of being June's mother and not one of the powers, and my parents had every power and not one of the consequences, and Becca had a picture on a wall. In April of my 20th year, Harrow County sent a letter about the guardianship coming up for its 3-year review. A hearing on a Friday. Routine, the letter said. And my mother read it at the kitchen table and got very quiet, and then she got very busy. And 3 days before that hearing, I came home from a night shift at 6:40 in the morning and found my parents and Becca and a man in a gray suit sitting in our living room with a folder on the coffee table, waiting for me. I stared at the folder on the coffee table and did not take my coat off. I had June's diaper bag on one shoulder and my Pinehurst badge still clipped to my collar, and I had been awake for 22 hours, and the living room smelled like coffee, which meant they had been up a while, which meant they had timed this for the exact moment I walked in the door at my absolute worst. My mother had made coffee for a lawyer at 6 in the morning. That is who she is. That is the whole woman in one detail. The man in the gray suit stood up and put out his hand and said his name was Cobb, and that he did some work for the Ashby family and was helping out as a favor. He said the word favor, the way you would set down something breakable. I shook his hand because my body did it before I could stop it. My father was on the couch with his forearms on his knees looking at the carpet, which is what my father does, which is his entire contribution to every hard moment of my life. Becca was in the armchair by the window with her knees pulled up. She was 17 now, taller than me, with her hair cut short for swim team, and she had a Halden hoodie on, and she would not look at me. My mother was standing. My mother is always standing. Sit down, honey, she said, and I did not sit down. And she waited about 4 seconds and then decided to pretend I had. Mr. Cobb opened the folder. There were 3 documents. He walked me through them in order, and his voice was pleasant and even, and he never once used a word that was not true, which is the thing about people like Mr. Cobb. They do not lie. They just arrange true things into a shape. Document 1 was a renewal and extension of my parents' guardianship of June. 24 more months. Standard, he said. The court prefers stability. Document 2 was a consent and waiver in which I agreed not to contest that guardianship and acknowledged that I was not seeking custody. Document 3 was an affidavit. Sworn. Notarized. In it, I would state, under penalty of perjury, that I am the biological mother of the minor child June Kessler, that the information on the certificate of live birth filed in Ellisview is true and accurate to the best of my knowledge, and that no other person has a maternal claim to the child. Mr. Cobb said the third one was really just housekeeping. He said the county had flagged an irregularity in the original filing, some out-of-state paperwork thing, and that the affidavit would close it out cleanly and nobody would have to look at it again. Nobody would have to look at it again. I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it standing in my coat at 6:45 in the morning with a diaper bag on my shoulder. Because I had been a certified nursing assistant for 4 years by then, I had filled out 10,000 pieces of medical paperwork, and I knew exactly what an irregularity in an out-of-state birth filing meant, and I knew that a county does not flag things for fun, and I knew that the reason my mother had gotten very quiet at that kitchen table, and then very busy, was not that the review is routine. Somebody at Harrow County had pulled a thread, and the affidavit was not housekeeping. The affidavit was a rivet. The moment I swore that I was June's biological mother, in writing, as an adult, of my own free will, the fraud stopped being something that had been done to a 17-year-old and became something that a 20-year-old had chosen. It moved the crime from my mother's side of the table to mine, and if I ever tried to tell the truth after signing it, the first person the state would come for would not be the woman who typed my name into that field. It would be me. My mother watched me read it. She has a way of watching that is not watching. She was folding a dish towel. She folded it and unfolded it and folded it again, and she said, "It is the same as what you already did. It is just tidier." Becca said, "Mom, just once." Quietly. My mother said, "Becca, you have a chemistry exam at 10. And Becca went quiet. Mr. Cobb produced a pen. It was a nice pen, heavy, and he set it on top of the affidavit and turned the folder toward me on the coffee table. The room did the thing rooms do when you have not slept. It went slightly soft at the edges and slightly loud in the middle. Upstairs, I could hear June starting to wake up, that low complaining noise she made before she committed to crying, and every cell in my body wanted to go up those stairs. And that is exactly why they had scheduled this for 6:45. Everything in that house was scheduled. I asked what happens if I do not sign. My father looked up for the first time. Mr. Cobb capped and uncapped his pen and said, "Well, then the county goes ahead and reviews the original filing, and if there is an error in it, they will want to know how it got there, and the people who could be exposed by that are your parents and, I'm afraid, you." He smiled. He said, "You signed it too." I said, "I was 17. He said, "You were 17 when you signed the certificate. You are 20 now, and you have been representing yourself as this child's mother to a state assistance program for 2 years, and that is its own matter entirely." He said it kindly. He said it the way you tell somebody their car is going to need a whole new transmission. And that was when I understood that the white envelope on Fridays and the man in the gray suit doing a favor for the Ashby family were the same sentence, and I did not yet understand why, but I understood that Grant Ashby had sent a lawyer to my living room to make sure I signed a piece of paper about a baby, and that no part of that made any sense if this was just a teenager's mistake in a small town. If it was only Becca's reputation, you send a lawyer nowhere. You send a lawyer when there is a felony with an adult's name on it. I did not think that in words. I want to be honest about what I actually had in my head at 6:45 in the morning, which was mostly noise and the sound of June upstairs, but something turned over in me in that living room. Something got quiet in the way a room gets quiet before weather. I picked up the pen. My mother stopped folding the towel. I put the pen down on the coffee table next to the folder without signing anything, and I said, "I want to read it somewhere that is not here." Mr. Cobb said, "Of course." My mother said, "Ren," and I said, "The hearing is Friday. It is Tuesday. I will read it, and I will tell you Thursday." And I picked up the diaper bag and I went upstairs to get June, and behind me nobody said one word, which frightened me more than shouting would have, because it meant they were not surprised, which meant they had a plan for this too. Here is what my parents did in the next 11 hours. My mother took my phone. Not physically, she did it the modern way, which is worse because you cannot show a bruise from it. We were on a family plan in her name. That afternoon my texts stopped delivering and my data stopped working, and when I called the carrier from the landline, they told me the account holder had suspended my line and only the account holder could restore it. My mother said it was a billing thing and she would sort it out after Friday. Second, the joint account. Every paycheck from Pinehurst went by direct deposit into an account with my name and my mother's name on it, which she had opened for me when I was 16 and which I had never changed because when do you ever change anything? And that afternoon my card came back declined at the fresh market with $11 of formula and applesauce on the belt and 4 people behind me. I had $4,100 in that account. I had put every dollar of it there myself, in 12.5-hour pieces, in the dark, 4 nights a week, for 2 years. She had not taken it. She had just moved it into savings, which she was entitled to do, which was the point. It was not theft. It was a demonstration. Third, my documents. My social security card, my birth certificate, my CNA license card, my passport from a school trip in 10th grade, and June's papers. All of it lived in a gray metal lockbox in my parents' bedroom closet, because that is where important things lived in our house. And when I went in that night, the closet shelf was empty and the lockbox was gone. Fourth, the car. A 2009 Corolla with 180,000 miles that I had bought with my own money at 18, and which was titled in my father's name for the insurance rate. And on Wednesday morning, my father took the spare key off the hook by the door and put it in his pocket in front of me and said nothing at all. And fifth, June. June was the real lock. Everything else was just noise around the real lock. I could have walked to Pinehurst. I could have slept on Priya's couch. I could have gotten a new phone at the Walmart Mart in Danvers with cash I did not have. None of it mattered because my parents were June's legal guardians and I was not. And if I walked out that door with her, I was not a mother leaving with her daughter. I was an adult removing a child from her court-appointed guardians, which has a name, and the name is a felony. And if I walked out that door without her, I was leaving a 2.5-year-old in that house with the people who had built all of this, and I would never get her back because the first thing they would do is file, and the first thing a judge would see is that I had gone. They had me from both sides and they knew it. I have thought a lot about how they knew it. I do not think my mother sat down with a legal pad and worked it out. I think she just understood, the way she understands weather, that if you make a person responsible for something they love and give them no authority over it, you can steer them anywhere you want forever. Wednesday I worked a night shift because we needed the money, and because if I did not show up, Pinehurst would write me up. Charge nurse that week was Wells, a woman about 50 with reading glasses pushed up into her hair permanently, who had been at Pinehurst 19 years and who had never in 4 years asked me a single personal question, which was why I liked her. Around 4 in the morning, I was charting in the back station and my hands were shaking, and I could not get the numbers into the boxes, and Wells came in and looked at me for a while, and then poured 2 cups of coffee and set one down next to me and said, "Whatever it is, you are going to want it written down." I said, "What?" She said, "I have been doing this since before you were born, and every single time somebody's family is doing something to them, the thing that saves them is that somebody somewhere wrote it down at the time, not after, at the time." She took her glasses out of her hair and cleaned them on her scrubs, and she said, "People think it is about proof. It is not about proof. It is about dates." Then she went to do a med pass and never mentioned it again. I want to be clear that Wells did not know one thing about my life. She was talking about a resident whose son was selling her furniture, but I drove home at 6:40 in the morning in a car I was not sure I still had access to, and I thought about dates, and I thought about a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet with a plastic hospital wristband in it that had a date printed on it in that thin, gray hospital font. A date in March 3 years earlier, at a clinic 4 hours across the state line, on a night when my little sister was 15 years old and I was standing against a wall in borrowed scrubs. Thursday morning I told my mother I would sign on Friday at the courthouse, right before the hearing, with the notary there. She said that was smart, that it was cleaner that way. She made me pancakes. I sat at that table and ate pancakes with my mother and my father and my sister and my daughter, who is not my daughter. And my mother talked about redoing the bathroom and I said, in the right places. And the entire time I was doing arithmetic about a shoebox. My mother left at 9 to take Becca to Halden for the exam and to pick up the dress for that night, because Thursday night was the Halden Scholars Banquet, which is a thing that town takes seriously. 300 people in the gymnasium at $19 a plate. My father left at 9:15 for the shop. That gave me the house. I went up to my room with June on my hip, and I put her down with a bowl of dry cereal and the tablet playing the show about the ocean, and I dragged the desk chair to the closet, and I got the shoebox down. I had not opened it in 3 years. It had a rubber band around it that had gone brittle, and it broke when I touched it. Inside was the wristband, thin white plastic, printed in that gray hospital font, room 214, a date in March, and my name, because everything at Ellisview said my name. Under the wristband was the discharge packet from that week, folded into quarters, the one they hand you in a plastic sleeve when you leave and nobody ever reads. Under that were $1,140 in cash, in 20s, which I had been putting there $30 and $40 at a time for 2 years, for no reason I could have explained to you. Tips from covering weekend shifts, birthday money from my grandmother before she died. Under that was a small black voice recorder about the size of a cigarette lighter. Priya gave me that recorder as a joke. Priya Raval had been my lab partner since 7th grade, and she was the only person from Marbury High who kept texting me after I came home with a baby, and she went to Calder State on time. And the summer before she left, she gave me that recorder wrapped in newspaper as a gag gift, because I had complained once that I would never be able to keep up with a lecture and take notes at the same time. There was a card with it that said, "For when you finally go." I had put it in the shoebox because I could not look at it. It still had the batteries in it. It still worked. I pressed the button, and it made a small red light, and I pressed it again, and it stopped. And then I unfolded the discharge packet, and about halfway down the second page, on the newborn summary, in a row of standard values that any CNA reads 100 times a month and never once thinks about, was June's blood type, AB positive. I sat on the floor of my bedroom with my back against the bed, and I read that line probably 9 times. Pinehurst runs a staff blood drive every October in the parking lot in a bus. I had given 4 times. I knew my type the way I know my birthday. O negative. And there is a fact about that which is not complicated and is not a matter of opinion and does not require a lawyer, and I had known it since I was 16 years old sitting in a classroom, which is that an O mother cannot produce an AB child. Not sometimes. Not usually not. She contributes an O. The child needs an A from one parent and a B from the other. It is arithmetic. It is the same arithmetic my mother did in that parking lot, except this one does not care whose picture is on a wall. For 3 years I had been buried under a mountain of paper with my name on all of it, a birth certificate and an assistance application and a daycare form and a pediatric intake, a mountain so big I could not see over the top of it, and the whole time the thing that dissolved it had been sitting folded in quarters in a shoebox in my closet, costing nobody anything. $40 at a walk-in lab. That is what it costs to prove a blood type. $40 and a swab of a cheek for the second half, but the first half is $40. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be accurate about this because it is the part people get wrong. I sat on that floor and I felt sick, because the second thing you understand after you understand you can prove it is that you have to decide whether to. Proving it does not just free me. Proving it takes a 17-year-old girl who has a chemistry exam at 10 and a swim meet on Saturday and puts her name into a courthouse. It takes June, who is 2.5 and who calls me mama and who has never in her life been in a room without me for more than 12.5 hours, and it hands her to a judge. And it takes my mother and my father, who I hate hated by then in a way so complete it had stopped feeling like anything, and it makes them defendants. I sat there and I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said do it, and I still sat there another 40 minutes. June came in around 11 trailing the tablet by its cord and put a piece of dry cereal on my knee, because that is what she did when she thought you were sad. She gave you a piece of her food, and she looked at me with that face. And I want to be careful here because people always want this to be a story about how much I loved her. And it is, but it is also not, because the reason I got up off that floor was not love. It was that I looked at her and I thought, in 10 years, she is going to be 14. In 10 years, she is going to be exactly as old as Becca was, in exactly that house, with exactly those people. And Grant Ashby is going to be 51 and still at every birthday. And I got up off the floor. I put the wristband and the discharge packet and the cash in the diaper bag. I put the recorder in the front pocket of my jeans. And then I did the two things that I have been told since by 3 separate lawyers were the only reason any of this worked. And I did both of them by accident because I am not clever. I was just tired and scared, and I had a charge nurse who told me it is about dates. The first thing I did was walk down to the fresh market and use the $10 of my own cash in the diaper bag to buy a prepaid phone. $47 actually, which took most of what was loose in my pocket. And I bought the cheapest one in the case and I activated it standing in the parking lot. And with it I called Priya, who picked up on the 4th ring and said, "Who is this?" And I said, "It is me." And she was silent for about 2 seconds, and then she said, "What do you need?" and did not ask a single other question. Not one, not then, and not for the next 11 hours. And the second thing I did was go home and photograph every page of the discharge packet, front and back, the wristband, both sides, with a ruler next to it because I had seen that done on a form once. Then I went into my parents' bedroom where the lockbox was not, and I went into the kitchen drawer where the green spiral notebook lived, my mother's notebook with everybody's passwords in it in her round, careful handwriting, and I photographed all 14 pages of that too. And then I opened the drawer under the microwave where the household mail went to die, and I photographed the last 11 months of it, statements, notices, everything, without reading any of it, because I did not have time to read, and I did not know what mattered. Page after page after page. It took me an hour and 10 minutes, and I did it with June sitting on the counter, eating grapes. There was one thing I did stop and read. In the microwave drawer, in a windowed envelope, was a payment history from Harrow County Savings on the second note on our house, the one Grant Ashby held. And it showed that the second note had been paid down by $19,000 in a single payment in the April 3 years earlier, which was the month we came home from Ellisview. My father made $41,000 a year at that shop. I stood in the kitchen with my phone in my hand, and I looked at $19,000, and I thought about a white envelope arriving every Friday for 5 months, and about a lawyer doing a favor for the Ashby family, and about a man who came to a middle school awards night, and about my mother in a parking lot saying we are not doing that tonight. And the floor went out from under the last 3 years of my life. It was not a teenage mistake. It had never been a teenage mistake. Nobody pays $19,000 to protect a 14-year-old's scholarship. They pay it to buy a family, and what they buy is silence, and the receipt for the silence was me. I do not remember most of the next 2 hours. I know I fed June lunch because there were dishes. I know I put the phone in my sock, physically in my sock, which is not a good hiding place but was the only idea I had. At 2 o'clock, my mother came home with a garment bag and a tray of cupcakes and asked me to help her with the clasp on her necklace, and I stood behind my mother in her bedroom and did up the clasp on her necklace with my hands steady, and she looked at me in the mirror and smiled and said, "You look tired," and I said, "I am fine," and she said, "After tomorrow everything calms down." The banquet was at 6. The Halden Gymnasium had round tables with white cloths and a projector screen and a folding stage, and there is a specific way that people in a town of 9,000 look at you when you walk in with a stroller and no wedding ring, and by then it did not even land anymore. It just went through me like weather. We sat at table 9. My mother arranged us, my father, my mother, Becca, me, June, in the high chair on the end nearest the door, which was the seat I had been given at every public event for 3 years, because the one on the end is the one that leaves when the baby fusses. Grant Ashby was at table 2. He is not a large man. That is the thing nobody expects. He is medium height and going soft, and he wears a windbreaker with the shop logo on it to formal events as a kind of joke about himself, and he laughs with his head back, and he has a very good memory for people's names, and everybody in Marbury likes him. He came over during the salads with a plate in his hand, and he put his other hand on the back of my father's chair and said something about a truck that was coming in Monday, and my father laughed, and then Grant Ashby looked down the table at Becca and said, "Big night," and Becca said thank you, and then he looked at June and said, "She is getting big," and then he looked at me, and he held it, half a second longer than a person holds it. And I had sat at tables with that man since I was 9 years old, and I had never once noticed anything, and now I was looking at him with $19,000 in my pocket, and I knew, in a way that had nothing to do with evidence, that he knew that I knew, and that he was not worried, and that he had never once been worried, because tomorrow morning at 9, there was a notary at the courthouse, and a woman named Wren Kessler was going to swear that a child was hers. He went back to table 2. My hands were flat on the tablecloth, and I made myself count to 30. Then the lights went down, and the program started, and I sat there for 3 hours in a folding chair while a school gave my sister an award. There were 4 speeches. There was a slideshow with music. Becca's picture came up twice, once from the wall in the front office, and once from a lab in a white coat that was too big for her, and the room did the warm noise that rooms do, and my mother put her hand over her mouth, and I looked across the table at my mother's face in the dark with the projector light on it, and I understood that she was not pretending. She was genuinely, completely happy. That was the worst thing I saw that night, and I saw a lot of things that night. Then the head of school got up and read the scholars' names, and Becca stood and walked up in a blue dress and shook a hand and turned to the room and smiled with her whole face for 1 second, and I saw her her look for us in the dark, and I saw her find my mother, and then I saw her keep going and find me, and hold there. And then she looked away and went back to her chair. She could not have been up there more than 40 seconds. At 9:10, they served coffee, and the room broke into small groups the way rooms do. And my mother went to talk to the head of school, and my father went to talk to Grant Ashby, and Becca was surrounded by 4 girls from the swim team. And June had been in a high chair for 3 hours, and had reached the end of what a 2.5-year-old can do. And she started to fuss. And I stood up with her on my hip and the diaper bag on my shoulder, exactly the way I had stood up at 100 public events over 3 years. And I walked out the side door of that gymnasium, and not one single person in that room turned around. Because that was my job. For 3 years, my job at every public event in that town had been to be the one who takes the baby out. They had trained the entire room, over 3 years, to not look at me when I left. They built it. They maintained it. And on the last night, it was the only door out of that building that nobody was watching. The side door of the Halden Gymnasium lets out onto a service walk between the building and the tennis courts. And it was cold for April, and it had rained during the slideshow. June stopped fussing the second the air hit her, the way she always did. I stood on that walk with my daughter on my hip, and I could hear the room I had just left through the wall, 300 people making coffee noise, and I had maybe 4 minutes before somebody at table 9 looked at an empty chair. There were 2 problems. The first was that I did not have a car, and the second was that I did not have a car seat. And there is a whole category of person who will tell you that in a moment like that, you do not stop for a car seat. Those people have not held a 2.5-year-old. I went around the back of the building to the north lot where my mother had parked, and my mother's car was unlocked, because my mother has never locked a car in her life in that town. And I unbuckled the base and lifted the whole seat out, and I stood there in the dark, holding a car seat in one arm and a child in the other. And I looked at the school building with the light coming out of the gymnasium windows, and I thought about my sister in a blue dress. I want to say I agonized. I did not have time to agonize. I did the arithmetic. Becca was 17 and a minor. If I took her, that is not a sister leaving with a sister. That is an adult transporting somebody else's child across a county line without consent. And it would have taken every true thing I was about to say and turned it into a kidnapping story. And every reporter and every judge and every person in Marbury would have talked about the kidnapping, and nobody would have talked about the $19,000. If I left her, she was going to wake up tomorrow inside the worst week of her life with nobody in the house on her side. And she was going to be told a version of that morning by my mother. And she was going to believe it, because she had believed my mother about everything for 3 years. Both of those were true. I picked the one that ended with somebody going to prison. I have never once been sure I picked right. Priya's car was at the far end of the visitor row with the lights off, and she had been sitting in it since 20 of 6. 11 hours after a phone call from a number she did not recognize, she had driven 40 minutes from Calder State and parked in the lot of a school she did not go to, and waited 4.5 hours in the dark on the chance that I came out. She had a full tank. She had bought a phone charger and a case of water and a box of the crackers June liked, which she remembered from one afternoon 2 summers before. She got out and took the car seat out of my arms without a word and had it strapped into her back seat in about 90 seconds, and then she looked at my face in the parking lot light and said, "Are we going now, or are we going to talk about it?" I said now. We went out the back of the lot onto Ridge Road, and we were on the state highway in 6 minutes. I watched the Halden lights go small in the side mirror. June fell asleep before we hit the county line, the way she always did in cars, her head over sideways with her mouth open. And Priya drove exactly the speed limit with both hands on the wheel like somebody's grandmother, and neither of us said anything for about 20 minutes. Then I told her. All of it. From the hospital parking lot when I was 17 to the blood type on the second page to the $19,000 on the second note. It took about 40 minutes, and I did not cry once, which worried her more than crying would have. When I got to Grant Ashby, she pulled off at a rest area and sat with the engine running and put her head against the headrest and looked at the ceiling of the car for a long time. Then she said, "Ren, that whole time." And I said, "That whole time." And she said, "I sat behind you in chemistry for 4 years." And I said, "I know." And she said, "I thought you had a boyfriend nobody knew about. I thought I was the only person who did not judge you, and I want you to know that I still thought that. I still had a version in my head. And that is the part about a lie that big. It does not only take the years. It goes into every person who loves you, and it puts a small wrong thing inside them that you did not put there and cannot take out." We drove 3 hours to Danvers, where Priya's cousin Nadia had a 1-bedroom above a dry cleaner. Nadia is a dental hygienist who was 26 and who opened the door at 1:40 in the morning in a bathrobe and looked at a girl she had met twice and a toddler and a diaper bag and said, "Bathroom is on the left. There are towels on the radiator," and went and made up the couch. She did not ask what happened for 2 days. I have thought about what it cost those 2 women to do that without asking. Nadia had a lease and a job and no reason on earth. I put June down on Nadia's bed with pillows on the open side, and I stood in the doorway of a stranger's bedroom at 2 in the morning and watched her sleep, and I understood, in a very calm and very complete way, what I had actually just done. I had not rescued anybody. Legally, in the state we were in, at that moment, I was an adult who had removed a minor child from the physical custody of her court-appointed guardians without their knowledge or consent and transported her across 3 counties in the middle of the night. It did not matter that my name was on her birth certificate. It did not matter that I had raised her every day of her life. It did not matter that I was, as it happened, actually her aunt. There is a specific word for what I was, as of 11:40 that night, and my mother was going to be able to say it to a judge at 9 o'clock the next morning, and it was going to be, on the face of it, completely true. So I did the only smart thing I did that entire week, and I did it at 2:15 in the morning on a prepaid phone standing in a stranger's kitchen. I did not wait for them to report it. I called the Harrow County Sheriff's non-emergency line myself, and I gave my name, and I said that I wanted to make a report about a child in my care, and I told the deputy who answered exactly where I was, the address, the town, the apartment number, and the name of the person whose couch I was on. I said I was not hiding. I said the child was safe and asleep, and I would produce her to any officer at any hour. I said there was a guardianship hearing in Harrow County at 9 that morning, and that I would not be attending it, and that I wanted a record of this call with a timestamp. He asked me twice if I was in danger. I said not tonight. He read the address back to me and gave me an incident number, and I wrote it on the inside of my forearm in ballpoint pen because there was no paper, and it was still there 4 days later when I met Nolan Reyes. Faded, but readable. And the first thing that man ever said to me after hello was, "Whose idea was that?" I said nobody's. He said, "That is the single reason you are sitting in my office and not in a holding cell. So if you ever figure out whose idea it was, thank them." It was Wells. It was a 50-year-old charge nurse pouring coffee at 4 in the morning in a back station in Marbury saying it is about dates. The hearing went ahead at 9 without me. It took 11 minutes. My mother told a judge that her daughter had a history of instability, that she had walked out of a family event the previous evening with the child and disappeared, and that she was refusing to appear. Mr. Cobb had drafted the emergency motion the night before, which I know because it was time-stamped at 11:52, which was 12 minutes after I called the sheriff, which means Mr. Cobb wrote it before anybody in that family had any idea where I was. He had it ready. He had it ready because they had planned for Thursday going wrong, the same way they had a plan for me not signing on Tuesday. And I have never stopped thinking about the fact that a lawyer sat down and wrote that motion as a precaution the way you would buy an extra battery. The judge granted an emergency order that morning, giving my parents sole physical custody and directing law enforcement to assist in the return of the minor child. That is a pickup order. It is 1 page. By 11 a.m. on Friday, it existed in a database, and it did not matter one bit where I was or how honest I had been at 2:15 in the morning, because the entire hearing had happened in a room where the only person who spoke was my mother. 2 deputies came to Nadia's apartment at 4:20 that afternoon. Nadia let them in and stood against the counter with her arms crossed. June was on the floor doing the thing where she put crackers in a shoe. One deputy was maybe 25 and would not look at me, and the other one was in his 50s and had the incident number from my own call already written on his notepad. And he sat down at Nadia's kitchen table and said, "I am going to be straight with you. This order says I take her back to Harrow County today, and there is no version of this afternoon where I do not." I said, "She is my daughter." He said, "I know what the paper says." And then he said the thing that took the floor out from under me for the second time in 2 days. He said, "Ma'am, the paper is the only thing I have got. You can be the most right person in this state, and I still only have the paper. That is what an institution is." I did not understand that before that Friday. I had grown up believing that if you could show somebody the truth would do something. What I learned at 4:20 on a Friday in a dry cleaner's upstairs apartment is that a truth with no document under it is a feeling, and feelings do not move deputies. I packed June's bag. I put the crackers in it. I put the blanket with the ducks on it in it. I put her in the car seat in the back of a county vehicle myself because the older deputy let me do that, which was a kindness he did not have to do. And I buckled the harness and checked the chest clip the way I had checked it 1,000 times. And June thought it was a game and said the word for going. And I said, "Yes, going." And I stood up and closed the door. I got about 11 feet from the car before my legs stopped working, and Nadia caught me under the arms in a parking lot behind a dry cleaner in a town I had been in for 15 hours. The next 4 days were the worst 4 days, and I want to describe them accurately because everybody who tells this kind of story skips them, and they are the part where most people give up. And the reason most people give up is not that they are weak. It is that in those 4 days, the entire machine tells you, over and over, in a polite voice, that you do not exist. Saturday, I called Harrow County Child Protective Services and reported that a child had been born to a 14-year-old and that the birth had been falsely registered. The intake worker was patient and thorough and asked me for the child's name, and I said June Kessler, and she asked me for the mother's name, and I said, "That is the report," and there was a pause, and she asked me my relationship to the child, and I said I am listed as her mother, and she asked me whether I was currently the subject of a custody order, and I said yes, and I could hear her typing change. She took the report. It went into a queue. Queues in that county at that time were running 11 to 14 days for anything not classified as immediate physical danger, and a 3-year-old paperwork problem is not immediate physical danger, and she was not wrong about that. Sunday, I called Ellisview Women's Clinic from Nadia's landline and asked how a person requests a correction to a birth record, and a woman told me that corrections go through the Vital Records Office of the state where the birth occurred, and that the person requesting has to be a parent or a legal representative and would need to submit documentary evidence and pay a fee. I asked what counted as documentary evidence. She said typically a court order or a genetic test. I said, what if the person requesting is the person on the certificate who is saying the certificate is wrong? There was a long silence, and then she said, I have never had that call before, and she said it kindly, and she gave me a phone number that turned out to be for a different department that was closed until Tuesday. Monday, I went to the courthouse in Harrow County with Priya driving, and I stood in line at the clerk's window for 50 minutes with my ballpoint incident number faded on my arm, and I asked how I would file a motion to set aside an emergency custody order. The clerk gave me a packet. It was 19 pages. On page 6, it said the moving party should attach any supporting evidence, not may, should. And I stood in that hallway with 19 pages in my hand, and I understood that the entire system was a machine that ran on documents, and that my parents had been feeding that machine documents about me since I was 17 years old, and that in 3 years I had produced exactly 0, and that they had produced dozens, all of them signed by me. I had signed everything. That is what they were counting on. They were not counting on me being weak. They were counting on there being a paper trail in which my own handwriting agreed with them at every single stage. Also on Monday, my mother started calling Nadia's landline. She got the number in about 36 hours, which tells you something about how 9,000 people works. She was not angry on those calls. I want people to understand this because everybody expects screaming. She was warm. She would say, I am not calling to fight. I just want you to know June had a hard night. She would say, she asked for you at breakfast. She would say, this can all stop today. You come home. Nobody is going to bring up Friday. We tell the judge it was a misunderstanding. You sign the affidavit. And by June, this is a thing we do not talk about anymore. And every single call ended the same way, with her saying, I love you, and me not saying it back, and her waiting 3 full seconds for it. On Tuesday, she stopped calling, and other people started. My father's sister called and cried and said I was breaking my mother. A woman from the fresh market who had known me since I was a baby left a voicemail about how my parents had raised me better than this. Somebody put a post up in a Marbury community group with a picture of me from 10th grade and a paragraph about how a local family was going through a difficult time with an adult child. And there were 91 comments and I read all of them, which was the stupidest thing I did that entire year. And on Tuesday afternoon, a man called the prepaid phone, which was a number that 4 people on Earth had, and said he was calling on behalf of Mr. Cobb's office and that his client's principal wanted to convey that there was no interest in escalating and that there were resources available to help me get set up somewhere, that there was a figure being discussed, and that if I wanted to have a conversation about a fresh start in a different state, he could arrange it discreetly. He never said the name Ashby. He said his client's principal. He said discreetly. He was on the phone for 1 minute and 40 seconds, and I stood in a dry cleaner's parking lot in Danvers and let him talk. And then I hung up, and then I sat down on the curb, and I started laughing and could not stop because a man had just offered to buy me in almost exactly the same way he had bought my family 3 years earlier, and he had not even bothered to change the method. He had bought us once for $19,000. Why would he change anything? It had worked perfectly. Then on Tuesday night, Becca called. She used a friend's phone. She got the number from my mother's notebook, which is the only funny thing in this entire story, that the green spiral notebook cut both ways. She was in a bathroom somewhere and she was whispering, and the first thing she said was, is June okay? And the second thing she said was, why did you do it? Not why did you leave? Why did you do it? And I said, do what? And she said, Mom said you asked to. She said you offered. She said you wanted to do it because you were failing chemistry and you did not want to go to Calder anyway. And this gave you a reason. And I stood in a parking lot in Danvers and I found out what my sister had believed about me for 3 years. My mother had told a 14-year-old that her big sister had volunteered. Of course she had. That is the only story that lets a 14-year-old survive it. If Becca believed I had chosen it, then Becca was somebody who had been helped. If Becca believed I had been made to, then Becca was somebody whose family had destroyed her sister to protect a man. And no 14-year-old can carry that. And my mother knew it. And my mother had solved that problem the way she solved every problem, by finding the version where nobody has to look at anything. I said, Becca, I did not offer. And she said, Mom said. And I said, Becca, listen to me. What is your blood type? And she said, what? And I said, do you know it? And she said, a positive. Why? I said, and Grant Ashby is at every single thing our family does and always has been. And Mom will not say his name to me. And Dad's second note got paid down $19,000 the month we got back from Ellisview. And there was a silence on that phone that went on so long I thought the call had dropped. And then my little sister made a sound I am not going to describe. And then the call ended. And she did not answer for 6 days. And those were the 6 days I was most afraid in my whole life. Not for me. Wednesday morning, I woke up on a stranger's couch with $1,100 in a diaper bag, no car, no license card, a suspended phone line, an emergency custody order against me, a CPS report in a 14-day queue, a 19-page packet that required evidence I did not have, and a state vital records office that wanted a court order or a genetic test. And I lay there and I went through it again, the way you go through a drawer you have already gone through, and I got to the last one and I stopped. A court order or a genetic test. They had told me the answer on Sunday. A woman in a records office had said the whole thing out loud to me on a Sunday afternoon, and I had been so busy hearing the word no that I had not heard the word. Or, there is a walk-in lab in a strip mall in Danvers, between a nail salon and a place that cashes checks, and they do a basic type and screen for $39.95. No appointment, no order from a doctor. Results the same afternoon by email or the next morning printed. I was there when they unlocked at 8. The phlebotomist was a heavy-set man in his 60s named Roy, who had a picture of a boat taped inside the cabinet door, and he asked me if I was donating or testing, and I said testing, and he asked what for, which he did not have to do, and I said I need to prove something about myself, and he said, well, that is most people, and tied the tourniquet. It took 40 seconds. Roy did not know what he was doing that morning. Roy will never know. I want that on the record somewhere. I paid in cash out of the diaper bag, and I sat in Priya's car in that strip mall for 6 hours because I did not have anywhere else to be, and at 2:15, a woman at the counter handed me one sheet of paper. Patient name, date of birth, collection date and time, specimen type, and then a box with 2 entries in it. ABO group, ORH type, negative. That is the whole document. It is not dramatic. It is smaller than a receipt. And I had a photograph on my phone of a newborn discharge summary from Ellisview Women's Clinic, dated 3 years and 1 month earlier, an official record generated by a licensed facility at the time of birth, with the infant's name and my name as mother, and, on the second page, in the routine values, AB positive. Put those 2 pieces of paper next to each other on a table, and you do not need a lawyer, a judge, a jury, or a DNA test. You need a person who took 10th grade biology. An O mother cannot have an AB child, not with an unusual father, not with a rare variant. It is not a probability. It is an impossibility. And the reason it matters so enormously in a courthouse is that everything else in my life was my word against my mother's word, and my mother is a 53-year-old church volunteer with a clean record and a nice handbag, and I was a 20-year-old with a suspended phone and a custody order against her. My word was worth nothing but a blood type does not have a handbag. I drove to the legal aid office in Danvers with those two things in a folder Nadia gave me, and I sat in a waiting room with 14 other people for 3 hours and 40 minutes under a television playing a cooking show with the sound off. When they finally called me back, it was to a cubicle, not an office. And a man came around the corner eating a sandwich over the wastebasket and said he had 6 minutes. Nolan Reyes was about 35 with his tie loose and a stack of files on the floor beside his chair because the desk was full. He asked me what I needed. I said I needed to correct a birth certificate. He said, everybody does. That takes a year and a court order, and I have 110 open cases. And I put the 2 pages on his desk facing him, and I said, that is my blood type from this morning, and that is the child's blood type from the night she was born. And I did not say another word. He kept eating the sandwich. Then he stopped eating the sandwich. He put it down on a napkin, and he pulled the pages toward him, and he looked at one and then the other and then back at the first one, and he was quiet for about 15 seconds. And then he said, sit down. And then he said, hold on. And he went and got a legal pad, and then he did not stop asking me questions for 2 hours and 10 minutes. He missed a hearing. His paralegal came in twice, and he waved her off. Somewhere in the first 20 minutes, he stopped writing and said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to not be offended. Why did you not do this 3 years ago? And I said, because I did not know I could. And he said, no. I mean, why did you not go to a teacher or a doctor or anybody at 17? And I said, because they were my parents, and they told me it was my fault, and I did not have anywhere to go, and I had a baby. And he wrote that down word for word, and later that sentence, almost exactly, ended up in a document that a judge read out loud. I gave him everything. The photographs of the discharge packet and the wristband. The photographs of 14 pages of a green spiral notebook. The photograph of the payment history on the second note showing $19,000 in a single payment in April 3 years ago. The incident number faded on my forearm. And the recorder. Because since Monday, since I stood in that courthouse hallway with 19 pages and understood that this was a machine that only eats paper, I had been holding Priya's little black recorder up against the earpiece of that prepaid phone for every single call. Everyone. My mother's warm calls, my aunt's crying, the woman from the fresh market. And Tuesday afternoon, 1 minute and 40 seconds of a man who never gave his name saying that his client's principal had no interest in escalating, that there were resources available, that a figure was being discussed, and that he could arrange a fresh start in a different state, discreetly. Nolan listened to that one twice with his eyes closed. Then he said, this state is one-party consent, which means you were allowed to make that, which means I can use it, and I want you to understand what you are holding. And I said, it is a man offering me money. And he said, no. He said, a lawyer's office contacted a party to an active custody proceeding and offered a thing of value contingent on that party leaving the jurisdiction. That is not a bribe. That is obstruction. And it is the single dumbest thing anyone in your family's orbit has done in 3 years. And it is the only piece of paper in this entire folder that is dated last week instead of 3 years ago. And last week is what gets a prosecutor's attention. Old crimes are homework. New crimes are a case. Then he pulled my mother's calls back up and played the Monday one again. And there is a place in it where my mother says, you come home, nobody is going to bring up Friday. We tell the judge it was a misunderstanding. You sign the affidavit. And by June, this is a thing we do not talk about anymore. He rewound it and played that 6 seconds 4 times. He said, she says the affidavit. She says it by name. She says it on a recorded line while an emergency order she obtained is in force. He set the recorder down and he looked at the ceiling for a second and he said, your mother is very good at this. And she has never once in her life had to do it against somebody who was writing it down. Nolan Reyes filed 3 things in the next 9 days. And I want to lay them out because people think a case is a moment. And a case is not a moment. A case is a stack. The first was an emergency motion to set aside the custody order, attaching the 2 blood type documents and a sworn declaration from me that ran to 11 pages. The second was a motion for genetic testing of the minor child, which is the only thing that actually mattered, and which he told me from the beginning was the whole ballgame, because a blood type proves that the certificate is false, and a DNA test proves who it is false about. The third was a mandated report of his own, because attorneys in that state are mandated reporters, and Nolan Reyes walked down the hall on a Thursday afternoon and filed a report stating that he had documentary evidence that a child had been born to a girl who was 14 years old at the time of conception, and that the birth had been registered under a different person's name, and he attached the discharge summary and the blood panel, and he sent a copy to the Harrow County District Attorney and a copy to the state police. And by doing that, he moved the whole thing out of my CPSQ and into a completely different building. That was the part I never would have known to do. I thought I was fighting a custody case. Nolan Reyes understood on day 1 that I was not in a custody case at all, that a custody case was the shape my mother had put on it, and that the actual thing on the table was a felony that a whole county had been standing on top of for 3 years. He said it to me in that cubicle on the first afternoon. He said, listen to me, nobody is going to care about a birth certificate. What they are going to care about is that a 14-year-old had a child, and not one single mandated reporter in that entire county ever made a report, and a doctor saw her, and a clinic saw her, and a school saw her every day, and a whole family sat at a table with her, and nobody wrote it down. And when a prosecutor sees that, they do not see a paperwork problem. They see how many people had to agree to look away. The state police went to Ellisview Women's Clinic on a Tuesday, 11 days after I paid $39.95 to have my own blood looked at. They did not go with a warrant the first time. 2 investigators went with a records request and a list of questions, and the clinic's director, who had been in the job 14 months and had nothing to do with any of it, walked them into an office and pulled the file and read the first page, and then said, I need a minute, and closed the door, and made a phone call. Renata Bell had left Ellisview 2 years earlier. She was 59 and worked in a dermatology billing office in a town about 40 minutes away, and had a granddaughter and a bad hip. When the investigators found her that Thursday, she was sitting on her back step with a folder on her knees. She had it on her knees. She had gotten it out of a closet before they arrived, because the clinic director had called her, and she had had 36 hours to decide what she was going to be, and she had spent the whole 36 hours getting a folder out of a closet and sitting on a step with it. Renata Bell had kept a copy of the original intake. That is the thing. The first visit, before my mother had gotten anywhere near her, before the money, a nurse practitioner at Ellisview had done an intake on a patient in a way that was completely routine, and on that form was a real name and a real date of birth and a real age, and the age was 14. There was also an ultrasound report from that first visit with a patient identifier on it. And when the amendment happened later, when the mother field became my name and my date of birth and my social security number, the original intake did not get destroyed, because Renata Bell was not a criminal. That is what I have had to make my peace with. She was not a criminal. She was a 56-year-old woman who was 3 years from retirement in a job that did not pay well, and a woman came to her with a story about a family and a scholarship and put $2,500 on the desk, and Renata Bell moved a name from one line to another line and told herself a sentence about how she was helping a child, and then she went home and could not sleep, and she photocopied the original intake and put it in a folder in a closet, and she kept it for 3 years and 1 month in a closet, in a house, 40 minutes from a clinic, while a girl she had met once carried the whole thing. When they asked her why she kept it, she said, in a recorded interview that I have read a transcript of 4 times, I do not know. I want that to be my answer for the rest of my life. That was the turn. Everything before Renata Bell was me saying things. Everything after Renata Bell was the state saying things. The blood types told a prosecutor that a certificate was false. Renata Bell told a prosecutor that it had been made false on purpose by a specific adult on a specific date for $2,500 in cash, and she named my mother, and she picked her out of a photo array, and she gave them a folder with an original intake in it that said 14. On the 2nd of the month, a judge in Harrow County ordered genetic testing of the minor child June Kessler and of Ren Kessler, and on the motion of the district attorney rather than mine of Rebecca Kessler, who was 17 and who by then had a guardian ad litem of her own, which is a thing I did not know existed until a lawyer named Sloan explained it to me in a hallway. My parents fought that order for 9 days. Mr. Cobb withdrew from the case on the 4th day. He sent a 2-paragraph letter citing an unforeseen conflict, and I have kept a copy of that letter because a man who wrote an emergency custody motion as a precaution on a Thursday night looked at what was coming in June and got out of the building. My parents got a new lawyer, a real one, and the real one told them to comply, and they complied. I gave my sample on a Wednesday morning at 9 in a room with a beige floor. It is a cotton swab, and they rub the inside of your cheek for 30 seconds and put it in a tube, and you sign a chain of custody form, and you are done in 4 minutes. And I sat in the parking lot afterward for a very long time because there was a version of me, a small, stupid, persistent version that had lived in my chest for 3 years, that had gotten used to something. I had raised her. I had done every night. I was the one she came to. And somewhere in there, without ever once saying it out loud, I had started to believe the lie a little, in the only place where it was mine and not theirs, which was that she was mine. And I had just voluntarily walked into a beige room and asked a laboratory to take that away. Nolan told me later that this is the most common thing in the world and that he sees it in every case like mine, and that it has a name and that people should stop being ashamed of it. I am still a little ashamed of it. The results came back 17 days later. Nolan called me at 6:40 in the morning, which was the exact time of day I used to get home from Pinehurst, and he said, "Are you sitting?" And I said, "Just say it." And he said, "The child is excluded as your biological offspring. Probability of maternity 0. And the child is not excluded as the biological offspring of Rebecca Kessler. Probability of maternity 99.99%. I said, "Okay." He said, "Ren." I said, "Okay." He said, "I am going to say the rest, and then I am going to hang up and let you have your morning." He said, "That order that took her out of Nadia's apartment was based entirely on a certificate that a state laboratory has now certified as false, and I am going to be in front of a judge on Friday. And I want you to understand that the argument I am making on Friday is not that you are her mother. It is that nobody in that house has ever had one lawful day of custody of that child. Not your parents, not you, not one day, because the entire chain starts with a document that does not describe a real event." And then he did hang up, and I sat on Nadia's couch at 6:45 in the morning, and I said the sentence out loud to the empty apartment to see how it sounded. "She is not mine. She was never mine. I am her aunt." I said it maybe 30 times. And here is what happened around the 20th time, and this is the thing I would put on a wall if I could. It stopped being a loss, because if she was never mine, then I never got pregnant at 14. And if I never got pregnant at 14, then the only person in that house who did was a child. And if a child did, then somebody did it to her. And if somebody did it to her, then there is a man, and the man has a name, and the man has been at every barbecue since I was 9 years old. And for 3 years, every single ounce of what that town thought about that pregnancy had been pointed at me, which meant that for 3 years, not 1 ounce of it had been pointed at him. That was the arrangement. That was what the $19,000 bought. It did not buy Becca a scholarship. It bought Grant Ashby a person to be talked about instead of him. I had not been a cover story for a teenage mistake. I had been a lightning rod installed on the roof of that house at 17, so that for 3 years everything would go into me and into the ground and nothing would ever reach him. Becca called me on a Sunday, 6 days after the last call, from her own phone this time, and she said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Danvers," and she said, "Can you come?" Her guardian ad litem, a woman named Sloan who was maybe 40 and who wore flat shoes and had the calmest voice I have ever heard on a human being, arranged the room. It was a conference room at a family services building with a window and a box of tissues on the table already, which I hated, and a plastic tray of cookies, which I hated more. Becca came in wearing the Halden hoodie hoodie. She had been living with her guardian ad litem's approved placement for 11 days by then, which was a foster family in Danvers with 2 little kids and a trampoline, and my parents had not been allowed contact for 9 of those days. And that is what 9 days without my mother in her ear did to my sister. She was 17 and she looked 40. She sat down across the table and she did not touch the cookies, and she said, "I need to tell you the whole thing and I need to do it fast or I am not going to do it." So I said, "Okay." And she told me that on the night at the hospital, in the room, before my mother came out to the parking lot, a nurse had asked her who the father was, and she had said a name. She had said his name out loud at 14 to a nurse in a hospital. And my mother had been standing right there. And my mother had said, "She is confused, she is not making sense," and had taken her hand and squeezed it hard enough to leave marks. And the nurse had written something down and left. And then my mother had leaned over the bed and said 6 words. And Becca has known these 6 words by heart for 3 years. Do not ever say that again. That was the night. That is what happened in the 20 minutes between finding out and telling me. My mother did not spend those 20 minutes deciding which daughter was expendable. She spent them deciding whether to have a conversation with a police officer or a conversation with a man who held the second note on her house, and she picked. And then she came out to a parking lot and told her 17-year-old the arithmetic about a scholarship, and the scholarship had nothing to do with anything. The scholarship was a story for me. Becca said that after that night, nobody in our family ever said his name in front of her again, not once in 3 years, and that he still came to the house, and that she got very good at knowing which room he was in from any point in the house by the sound. And I asked her how she got through those 3 years, and she said, "I did the arithmetic that Mom does." She said, "I told myself Ren offered." She said, "Mom told me you offered, and I decided to believe it because if you offered, then this was something we survived. And if you did not offer, then everybody I have left did this to you on purpose. And I was 14, and I could not have that. So I believed it. I believed it on purpose every day for 3 years." And she said, "When you asked me my blood type on the phone, I already knew. I knew before you finished the sentence." And then she said the thing I was not ready for. She said, "And there is a phone." In March, when we came back, my mother made Becca throw out her phone, stood in the kitchen and told her to put it in the trash. And Becca said, "Okay," and took it upstairs and did not throw it out and could not keep it in the house and could not think of anywhere on earth that was safe. And so on her first day back at Holden, she walked into the hallway by the gym where there is a blue plastic tub on the floor of the closet that says "Lost and Found" on a piece of masking tape, and she dropped a dead phone into it under a pile of jackets and jerseys and 1 bicycle helmet, and she walked away. And nobody empties that tub. Nobody has ever emptied that tub. It is a tub in a closet in a hallway of a school, and it had been sitting there for 3 years and 1 month with a 14-year-old girl's phone at the bottom of it. My sister was 14 years old, and she did the exact same thing I did with a shoebox in the exact same month, 300 yards apart. And neither of us ever knew, and neither of us could have told you why we did it. 2 children in 1 family, both of them told to destroy the thing, and both of them, on instinct, without a plan, without a word to anybody, kept it. I do not have a lesson about that. I just think about it constantly. Detective Sadie Marsh of the State Police went to Halden Academy with a warrant on a Wednesday morning, and a maintenance supervisor walked her to a closet in the hallway by the gym, and she took a blue plastic tub into evidence, whole, without emptying it, and the phone was at the bottom under a green windbreaker. It went to a forensic lab in the state capitol. I have never seen what was on it, and I never will, and I never want to, and I want to be very clear that nothing on that phone is going in this story, because it is not mine and it never was. It is my sister's, and the only thing anybody needs to know about it is that a laboratory recovered it, and that 4 months later a defense attorney stood up in a courtroom and tried to argue about a chain of custody on a lost and found tub and lost. Becca gave her statement over 2 days in a room with a camera in the corner, with Sloan sitting beside her, and I was not in the room because you are not allowed to be. And I sat in a hallway on a bench for 11 hours across 2 days. On the second day she came out at about 4 in the afternoon, and her face was gray, and she walked down that hallway, and she put her forehead on my shoulder and stood there, and neither of us said anything for a while. And then she said, into my shoulder, "I am so sorry about Calder State." Of everything she could have said, 3 years, a phone in a tub, a room with a camera in it, and the thing my sister apologized for was a nursing program. And I said, "Becca, I do not care about Calder State." And she said, "I know, but I do." On the strength of Becca's statement and the maternity result and the intake form Renata Bell had kept in a closet, a judge signed a warrant on the 14th for a buccal swab from Grant Ashby. 2 state police investigators walked into Ashby Auto Body at 10:20 in the morning on a weekday with that warrant, in front of 11 employees and 2 customers and my father, who was standing at the parts counter, and they took Grant Ashby into the back office and swabbed the inside of his cheek and put it in a tube and left. It took 9 minutes. That is the entire event. There was no shouting and no handcuffs, and he was open for business the rest of the day. But in a town of 9,000 people, 11 employees and 2 customers is a broadcast tower. By 6 o'clock that evening, every person in Marbury knew that the state police had walked into Ashby Auto Body and taken something out of Grant Ashby's mouth, and by 9 o'clock that evening, people were doing the arithmetic on their own porches. And I have been told by 3 separate people that the phrase that went around town that night was, "Wait, then whose was it? Whose was it? 3 years." That is how long it took for anybody in that town to ask a question that was answerable in 1 afternoon at a walk-in lab for $39.95. The paternity result came back on a Tuesday. Nolan called and did not do the "are you sitting down" thing this time. He just said the number, 99.9997%, and then he said, "I am going to give you one piece of advice, and it is the only advice I have given you that is not legal. Do not be in Marbury this week." They arrested Grant Ashby on a Thursday morning in the parking lot of his own shop at 7:40 before it opened, which is a courtesy the state police extend to people who have never given anybody any trouble. My parents were arrested the same morning at the house on on Ridge Road, separately, 20 minutes apart. My father first at the shop entrance and my mother in the kitchen. Renata Bell turned herself in that afternoon with her lawyer and her folder. 4 adults. The charges against Grant Ashby I am not going to itemize because they are what they are and my sister has to live in a world where people can look things up. The charges against my mother were conspiracy, offering a false instrument for filing, forgery, bribery of a records official, accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, and unlawful receipt of public assistance benefits. That last one because of a form I signed at 18 at a kitchen table between a shift and a nap. The charges against my father were conspiracy, accessory after the fact, and obstruction. Renata Bell was charged with falsifying records and accepting a bribe and pleaded to both within 6 weeks under a cooperation agreement, which is the deal she got for a folder in a closet, and 36 hours of deciding what she was going to be. Mr. Cobb was not arrested. Mr. Cobb was referred to the state bar, and the intermediary who called my prepaid phone was a paralegal in his office who lost his job and testified under an immunity agreement about who told him to make that call, and the answer was Mr. Cobb. And the answer to who told Mr. Cobb was, according to Mr. Cobb, nobody. He had simply used his own judgment, which is a sentence that a jury got to hear in the same week they heard a laboratory number with 4 9s in it. I was not in Marbury that Thursday. I was in a laundromat in Danvers with a bag of June's clothes when Nolan texted me the word done, and I sat down on a plastic chair between a dryer and a vending machine, and I did not feel one single thing. People want there to be a moment. There is no moment. I had been running on adrenaline and arithmetic for 5 weeks, and the arithmetic finished and there was nothing underneath it, and I sat in a laundromat and watched a dryer go around. Then a woman 2 chairs down asked me if I was all right, and I said yes, and then I cried for about 90 seconds in a laundromat in front of a stranger, and that was the whole emotional event, and then I folded June's clothes, because that is what I had come there to do. June came back to me on the 9th, not to me exactly. The order named an interim placement with kinship supervision and a case plan and a review in 60 days, which is a lot of words that mean a caseworker named Yolanda came to Nadia's apartment twice a week and looked in the refrigerator, but she came back. I picked her up at a family services office at 11 in the morning, and she had been away from me for 34 days, and she was 2 years and 8 months old, which is an age at which 34 days is a substantial fraction of everything you have ever known. She did not run to me. I want to tell you she ran to me. She stood behind the caseworker's leg and looked at me and would not come out for about a minute and a half, and I sat down on the floor of that office so I would not be tall, and I did not say anything, and eventually she came over and put her hand flat on my knee and stood there checking, and then she said mama and got in my lap and went completely limp, and I have never in my life been so glad to be a liar, because that is what I still was to her. That is the part nobody warns you about. On the 9th of that month, I got my daughter back, and the whole state of affairs was that she is not my daughter, and she was 2, and there is no version of a conversation you can have with a 2-year-old about a laboratory result, so we did not have one. Sloan and the caseworker and a child psychologist named Dr. Amari sat in a room with Becca and me and worked out what the 2 of us were going to be to that child, and in what order and on what timeline, and it took 4 months to build a plan for a person who was still eating crayons. Becca turned 18 in January. She was living with the foster family in Danvers until then, and she stayed on with them after because they were good and because she had 11 weeks of senior year left, and Halden Academy, to give them exactly the credit they are owed and not one bit more, kept her enrolled and quietly moved her to remote completion, and never once mentioned paragraph 4 of the conduct clause. My mother had spent 3 years and destroyed both of her daughters to protect a scholarship from a rule that the school, when it finally learned what had actually happened, did not even attempt to apply. They would never have pulled her. A child who was a victim of a crime was never in 1 second of danger from that conduct clause, and any human being at that school would have told my mother that in 30 seconds if she had asked, and she never asked, because she never wanted to know, because the clause was never the reason. The clause was the story. There is a whole industry inside a family like mine of manufacturing reasons, and I spent 3 years believing a reason that would have collapsed the first time anyone in that house said it out loud to a stranger. The district attorney's office offered my parents a deal in February. Both of them plead to 2 counts each, cooperate against Ashby, serve 18 months, out in maybe 11. Ms. Sloan, the prosecutor, who is not the same Sloan as the guardian ad litem and whose office was up 2 flights of stairs in a building with no elevator, called Becca and me in and explained it, and explained that the office's practice was to consult, but not to be bound, and asked us what we thought. Becca said no before the sentence was finished. I took longer. I sat in that office with the radiator clanking, and I thought about 11 months, and I thought about my mother folding a dish towel while a lawyer put a pen on top of an affidavit, and I thought about how she would come out of 11 months and be at a fresh market in a nice handbag telling people she had made mistakes, and I thought about how the entire strategy of my mother's life was to get everything moved into a room where nobody has to look at anything. A plea is that room. A plea is a room. You go in the room and you say the 2 smallest true things, and then it is over, and nothing gets said out loud, and no witness ever stands up, and the whole thing goes into a file. My mother would have taken that deal in 90 seconds, and she would have called it protecting her family. So I said no, and Ms. Sloan wrote it down and said, I want to be honest with you both. This means you testify, and it means his lawyer gets to cross-examine both of you, and it will be worse than you think. And Becca said, worse than what? The trial started in September in Harrow County, all 3 of them together, because the conspiracy count tied them and because the judge denied the motion to sever in about 4 minutes. It ran 9 days. I sat in the witness room on the first morning and looked around at who was in there, and that is the thing I would put in front of anybody who wants to understand what happened to my family. Renata Bell was on the bench by the window with her hands in her lap, and she looked very small, because she did not have the desk anymore, and people like that are most mostly the desk. Roy from the walk-in lab was there in a polo shirt with his phone in a plastic bag because they make you check it, and he was going to testify for 11 minutes about a tourniquet. Wells was there, still with the reading glasses in her hair, subpoenaed because I had told an investigator about a conversation at 4 in the morning about dates, and she had no idea why she mattered and kept saying she did not really know me. Priya was there. My chemistry teacher from Marbury High was there, the one who wrote my Calder State letter, and she had brought a folder with a copy of that letter in it, and she asked me if I wanted it, and I said not right now. And on the third bench, alone, was a woman I had never seen before in my life, about 60, in a cardigan, and she turned out to be the emergency department nurse who had been on shift in Harrow County at midnight 3 years and 6 months earlier, because she wrote it down. On that night, when a 14-year-old said a name and a woman in the room said she is confused, that nurse went out to the station and put a note in the chart, 4 lines, time-stamped. The note said what the patient had stated, and that the patient's mother had interrupted, and that the nurse had observed the mother grip the patient's hand. And then, at the bottom, the nurse wrote that she had notified the charge nurse and requested social work follow-up, and she had. She did everything a person is supposed to do. And then her shift ended, and it was midnight, and social work in that hospital at that time was 2 people covering 3 facilities, and the follow-up got queued and the family discharged in the morning against advice and moved out of state 4 days later to an address nobody had, and the referral closed as unable to locate. And that is the entire story of how the system missed it, and it is not a story about a villain. It is a story about a Tuesday. That woman had carried it for 3.5 years. She testified for 19 minutes and read her own note out loud from the stand, and when the defense attorney asked her whether she had considered that a frightened teenager might name someone at random, she said, no. And he said, no, you did not consider it. And she said, no, I considered it. That is why I wrote it down. My turn came on day 4, after lunch. I want to describe walking into that courtroom accurately because I had built it up in my head into a cathedral, and it is a room with bad carpet and a clock that is 4 minutes fast. My parents were at the defense table on the left. My mother had had her hair done and was wearing a blue cardigan I had never seen, and had a legal pad in front of her that she took notes on the entire 9 days, and she looked at me when I came in and her face did the warm thing it does, the same face from the pancakes, and I understood that she was still working. She was working right up to the last hour. Grant Ashby was at the far end in a suit that fit him badly, and he looked at the table. He looked at the table for 9 days. The prosecutor took me through it in order, and it took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The parking lot at 2 in the morning, the conduct clause, the deferral, the apartment over the hardware store and the maternity band from the thrift store and the folded towel, Ellisview, the signature, the gas station on the way back to Marbury and the 6 words about big sisters, which Mrs. Sloan made me say twice, the 3 years, the night shifts, the guardianship, the affidavit on the coffee table at 6:45 in the morning, the shoebox, the wristband, the blood type, $39.95. I did not cry. People have asked me about that, and I do not have a good answer except that I had spent 3 years learning how to sit at a table and say in the right places while my whole life burned, and it turns out that is exactly the skill a witness stand requires, and my mother taught it to me. She built the instrument that took her apart. The cross-examination lasted an hour and 10 minutes, and it went about the way Ms. Sloan said it would. He asked me why I had signed so many documents if I had been coerced. He asked me whether it was true that I had left a public event with a child in the middle of the night. He asked me whether I had ever told a teacher, a doctor, a counselor, a coach, a neighbor, or a police officer at any point in 3 years, and I said no to all 6, and he let the no sit there in the room for a while, and then he said, so we are asked to believe that a competent adult said nothing for 3 years, and I said, I was 17 for the first year, and he said, and after that, and I said, after that, I had a child in a house with 2 people who had every legal power over her, and I had none, and he moved on. He tried the chain of custody on the lost and found tub, and lost that on day 6. He tried the recordings, and the judge admitted them on day 2, because it is a one-party consent state, and he had known that going in and did it anyway for the jury. He tried, at the end, the only real argument he had, which was that my mother had been a frightened woman making a bad decision to protect a 14-year-old, and he built it carefully over 2 days, and Ms. Sloan took it apart in about 90 seconds in closing by putting 2 documents up on the screen next to each other. On the left, the Ellisview intake with the real name and the age 14. On the right, the payment history from Harrow County Savings, showing $19,000 paid against the second note in April, and she said one sentence to that jury. She said, a frightened mother protecting her daughter does not get paid. The jury was out for 2 days and 4 hours, guilty on every count against all 3. My mother made a sound when the clerk read the third one, and my father did not move at all, and Grant Ashby kept looking at the table, and I sat in the second row behind the prosecution, with my sister's hand in mine, and I felt the thing I had been waiting 5 months to feel, which was nothing. Again, still. Sentencing was in November. Grant Ashby got 22 years. My mother got 9. My father got 4. Renata Bell got 15 months and surrendered her records certification, and the judge said on the record that her folder was the reason the state had a case at all, and she cried, and I did not have anything for her either way. Mr. Cobb was disbarred the following spring. When my mother was allowed to speak before her sentence, she stood up and said that she had made decisions under pressure to protect her children, and that she had never intended for anyone to be hurt, and the judge let her finish and then said one thing to her before he read the number. He said, Mrs. Kessler, your daughter told this court that when she said she was losing everything she had worked for, you told her that is what big sisters are for. He said, I have thought about that sentence for 9 days. He said, you did not ask her. You told her what she was for. And then he read the number. The State Vital Records Office does not care about any of that. They care about a certified copy of a court order and a completed application and a fee of $32. It took 11 weeks. On a Tuesday in February, an envelope envelope came to an apartment that was mine, with my name on the lease and nobody else's, and inside it was a certificate of live birth for a child born in March 3 years and 11 months earlier, and in the mother field it said Rebecca Ann Kessler, and in the father field, which had said unknown for 4 years, it said a name. Becca graduated in June, not with her class at Halden, because she had finished remote in April and skipped the ceremony, and then in June she walked in the ceremony anyway, because Sloan told her she was allowed to, and because Becca decided at the last minute that she was not going to let a building keep anything else from her. She was 18. She wore the gown over jeans. 400 people in that gymnasium. The same gymnasium with the round tables and the projector screen. And I sat in a folding chair in the 3rd row with June on my lap, and my sister crossed a stage and looked out into the dark and found me on the first try. She gave me a card afterward in the parking lot. It was a graduation card, the kind from the rack at the Fresh Market, and she had scratched out the printed word on the front and written a different one. And inside she had signed both our names, hers and mine, one under the other, in the same handwriting. She said, "You did not get one, so this is yours too." Calder State reinstated me for the spring term. Not the scholarship, that money was 4 years gone, but the seat. And a woman in the financial aid office who had read about the case in the paper worked on it for 6 weeks and found me most of it out of 2 hardship funds and 1 endowed award for non-traditional students, and I called her ma'am for a year until she made me stop. I am in my 3rd semester. I work 2 12s at Pinehurst instead of 4, and Wells is still charge nurse on nights. And the first shift I came back, she looked at me over the glasses and said, "So, did you write it down?" And I said yes, and she said good, and handed me an assignment sheet, and that was the entire conversation, and it is the best conversation I have ever had. Becca lives 11 minutes away and works at a veterinary clinic and starts community college in the fall. June is 4. She is with Becca 4 days a week and with me 3. And there is a plan, made by people with credentials, for the year she is old enough to be told, and it does not happen for a while yet. And when it does happen, my sister and I are going to be in the room together, and neither of us is going to lie to her about one single thing. She calls me Ren now. She started doing it on her own, sometime around 3.5, the way kids do, and neither of us corrected her either direction. In March, the county clerk's office called me in to sign the standing co-guardianship, the one Becca and I had petitioned for together, which makes me the second name on every school form and every hospital admission and every consent for the rest of that child's childhood. The clerk's office in Harrow County is a counter with a laminate top and a bell you do not need to ring. The woman behind it had a beaded chain on her reading glasses, which I noticed, and which I have decided not to make mean anything. She printed 4 pages and slid them across the laminate toward me and turned them around with 2 fingers and said, "Initial here and sign at the bottom." 4 years ago, a woman said those exact words to me across a counter, and I signed in 11 seconds because a 17-year-old does what she is told. I read all 4 pages. I read them twice, the whole way through, including the part in small type at the bottom about penalties for false statement, which I read very slowly. Then I picked up the pen and I wrote my own name in my own handwriting, in a box that was actually mine, on the first true thing anybody in my family has ever filed.